I want you to listen to something. What does that mean to you? Well, here in the dictionary, I don't know why I do the whole dictionary Wikipedia thing, but sometimes you have to. I mean, when modern society is reassessed and reassumed what racism is, which again is the assumption and belief that your race is superior to other races, which indubitably you have to naturally assume race is theoretically a principle to one's functional consciousness before ever even instigating such a belief. Sometimes when people see one of the five races broken down by the 1400s scientific sort of anthropologic German scientist who, in fact, prove everyone it can be now sort of a subterfuge itself, be either red, brown, black, yellow, or white. Ultimately, um, we discover where racism is rooted. Um, so, naturally, when dealing with somewhat of a subterfuge of racially indicative complications, if you will, here in America, when America, again, going through a philosophical sort of brain workout or, the age old triangle, not the Illuminati. It's an old philosophical trick that you learned in Philosophy 101. If this equals this, then this has to be thus, and then therefore interlinks with that. It's the logic triangle. It ensures a basic thought is still within reason. Um, it gets a lot more complicated. It can go into much more high functioning symbols of figuring out what makes sense and what's logical. But ultimately, what I'm trying to explain to you is this: if we are going to go down this route where everyone who is white is a white supremacist, unless they are indubitably doing something, infusing a area unto which is sympathetic and or beneficial toward a rationalized principle, um, which somehow interferes with and splits the Caucasian race by liberal and conservative. Um, we have a erroneous philosophical principle in this because naturally I intend with cruel and unusual punishments to essentially prove the indicative anti-American sentiment evolving in society is derivative of ultimately and mostly, um, unfortunately, three principal groups, which, if analytically broken down, actually are rather evenly distributed in prosperous common denominators in terms of the populace of America itself. You can break this down through immigrants, Jewish people, black people, and white supremacists. Um, the rhetoric and wars in America fought between the two variable interests of these groups, if you will. Again, immigrant being recent immigrants, obviously. Um, Ultimately, you discover a rudimentary race being evolved around ultimately people who are brand new to the country and thus and therefore have less privilege principalized by their long-standing handing down of money within families, which is not an evil, it's commonplace. Henceforth, why they chose to come here in many cases, they couldn't really hand down a lot in countries of extreme turmoil and communist takeovers, exploiting people's exceptional amounts of family wealth to somehow resubjugate them towards some erroneous plight similar to Hitler's. Obviously, now we have to ignite a reasonable discernment of where and how these rhetorics have thus and therefore inflamed the insurrection and or re-insurrection of white supremacy against America. Um, Long story short, cruel and unusual punishments is going to prove, unfortunately, due to a lack of consideration for those people who are not indoctrinating themselves in action or their children to have an ethnocentric belief that they are superior in either conscious birthright or victim hand-me-down principle of what gives them the conscious creativity to assume they can either be cruel to or not accept or separate oneself in action. Ultimately, indubitably creates the ultimate subterfuge unconscious to the population in America. So, if we are going to infuse the white supremacists as having committed an insurgency, non-white supremacists, aka this little socialist, who is and always has been relatively unprejudiced, ultimately rather capable of interfering with the modern interpretation that ultimately, um, in fact, instigates the notion that it is race wars, ultimately in America, that have corrupted its essence, its national pride, and its indicative trajectory into a unified future, instigated through sort of a prison-like principle, which you see amongst ethnocentric gangs, essentially. I discovered it in jail. So even though there have been people who have gotten the short end of the stick in relation to the instigations of how and why white supremacy has always been relatively dominant in being the victimizer of this sort of instigation against America because of its diversity and being a melting pot, principally and dominantly compared to all other populaces. Um, by the end of evaluating Trump's instigation and insurgency, due to Trump's sort of ignorance to how serious and violent the white supremacistic principles he's inflamed overrode his ultimate anti-racism, which can be clearly displayed through his great relationship with his son and ultimately his philanthropic causes, while encouraging somehow almost terrorist-like attack and protest against minorities. Ultimately, it's going to be evaluated by the cruel and unusual punishments, how jail-like culture has influenced the lower underbelly of society itself, and thus projected a ultimate principle unto which has segregated societies and not divided and conquered us like some sort of existential British kind of conquering of ourselves, but a unfortunate, unconscious, and unconscionable act, which is going to be ensued a sort of guilt, if you will, against ultimately um, quite a few more groups than white supremacists if everyone refuses to admit what the true meaning of racism is, which is to believe one's race is supreme, which again implicates one believing that race is indicative of a consciousness supreme to another's. It's humility at its finest.